Sounds more like I can't hold a job, not that I don't have a job. Thank you, Catherine. Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to Western Michigan University Center for Humanities Spring Series on the Promise of Education. Tonight's guest, Diane Ravitch, is considered by many to be one of the nation's leading advocates for public education. When I heard she was coming here to Kalamazoo to talk about the promise of education, I couldn't think of a more apt topic and a more apt location. Kalamazoo has a long and rich history of being associated with changes in public education and watershed times. From the 1870s, when it was the home of the Kalamazoo school case, that's helped set the norm that secondary education, rather than just primary education, was a necessary ingredient for all citizens. We are also obviously famous in 2005 for establishing the notion that college education was also part of the essential development of all students through the promise. And so this is a town that has a long association with public education and the notion that education is central to the development of all of its citizens. And obviously WMU, which started out as a normal school, is a testament again to the notion that education, preparing teachers for education, preparing our young people for the world of learning is an essential part of our society's well-being. So we're really pleased to be able to have her here to talk about the promise of public education, the challenges that it faces, and how to best secure the future. She'll talk about educational reform and the promise of education, and she'll tell us about how to protect, which today is equally as important as how to improve public schools. She'll draw on 40 years of experience. She has been the author of 500 articles, some 40 books, I've been told, and reviews. And her blog has only 30 million pages visits a year since 2012. It is the primary destination for people looking for education research. She is the author of a New York Times bestseller, The Reign of Error, The Hoax of Privatization Movement and the Danger to America's Public Schools, as well as her previous book, The Death and Life of the Great American School System. In these books, Dr. Ravitch maintains that the crisis in American education is not the result of a crisis in academic achievement, but is a result of the destruction of public schools. She tackles topics like testing, national standards, equity, school choice, textbook development, and corporate influence. She is the product of public schools in the Houston area through her high school years. Yeah. And she earned her bachelor's degree from Wellesley College in 1960, and then a PhD from Columbia in 1975. She was previously held positions as the U.S. Secretary of Education for Research and Improvement during the George H. Bush administration. Today, she's a historian of education and education policy analysis and a research professor at New York University Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. She is the founder and president of the Network of Public Education. For those who like to Google people on the web, she is on all these lists of the 30 most innovative people in education alive today, and various other ones along that, which are all basically a statement about her incredible high quality. She is the winner of the Henry Moe Prize in the Humanities by the American Philosophical Society and the John Dewey Award for Excellence in Education by the United Federation of Teachers. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Diane Ravitch.
Thank you so much. I wonder, are there any teachers here tonight? No. Yeah. Hello. Whoa. Hello. Hi. First of all, I want to give a shout out to the Kalamazoo Education Association. Thank you for your lovely note. Kalamazoo Education Association. And then I want to begin by saying, expressing my greatest gratitude and admiration for the teachers in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Arizona, Colorado. The list is going to go on. These are all right-to-work states. These are people who are putting their jobs on the line and they don't have a union to represent them. They're out there because they want better funding for their schools and for their children. So I want to do something a little bit different tonight because this is the end of my year of lecturing. I'm starting a new book. And so I said, I'm not going to take any more lecture engagements, and probably by the time I finish, I'll just want to sit back and relax. So this may be my last lecture ever, so it's going to be different. So this is special, and I want to apologize, first of all, because I got snowed out last time. I was supposed to be here in mid-March, and we had a major snowstorm. They were predicting 12 to 18 inches. None of the airplanes came to New York, and we got 3 inches. And there was no way to get out because the airplanes were in California or in South Carolina or somewhere. But I wanted to tell you some things about myself that you may not know. Thank you, first of all, to Dr. Montgomery for the lovely introduction. As he mentioned, I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. I went to public schools from kindergarten through 12th grade. My high school was like most other high schools at that time, which was a long time ago, and you'll see soon how long ago it was. It had about 1,200 students. It had no unusual programs. I was not on a special track. I didn't have any AP classes. Everyone took the same courses. We didn't know it at the time, but we were untracked. We didn't have that word at that time. We had arts and civics and history and foreign languages and daily physical education. I mentioned daily because there are a lot of schools that no longer have daily physical education. The teachers wrote the tests we took. They were the ones that counted. After all, they knew what they had taught us. Who better to test us than our teachers? There were no standardized tests, except for some very silly tests of our occupational aptitude that were supposed to predict what we were going to do in the future. I don't remember what I was supposed to do in the future. Those tests didn't count. The first standardized test I ever took was the SAT, and at that time students were not allowed to know their own scores. The guidance counselor knew, but she never told students what they scored. That was the secret between her and the colleges. And she would decide where you should apply. Thanks to the encouragement of my rabbi and his wife, who was a graduate of Wellesley College, I applied to 3 women's colleges, and I was accepted by my first choice, which was Wellesley. And I preceded Hillary Clinton by 10 years. It was a transformative experience for me. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who were not only as smart as me, but a lot of them were a lot smarter than me. That was amazing. I went to college with amazing young women like Madeleine Corbell, who grew up to be Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State. One of my classmates became the producer of an iconic film called Dirty Dancing. I had so many talented people around me. College literally changed my life. I married immediately after college. I had children. I delayed going to graduate school. That's why my doctorate was 15 years after I graduated college. But I went to graduate school after I had children, and I earned a doctorate in the history of American education, and I started writing about education. Later, although I was a registered Democrat, I was invited to join the George H.W. Bush administration. I was Assistant Secretary of Education in charge of research and counselor to the secretary, who was Lamar Alexander. Lamar is now the senator from Tennessee, and he's the chair of the Senate Committee in charge of education. I wish I could say he listens to me, but he doesn't. He used to. During my nearly 2 years in the first Bush administration, I advocated on behalf of national standards in testing. My agency in the education department handed out $10 million in grants to leaders of different subject fields to write national standards. $10 million seemed like a lot of money at that time. Not anymore, as you'll see. In 1994, 2 years after I left, or really a year after I left, the effort to develop national standards blew up and is barely remembered today. I write about that in one of my last 2 books. A few years after I served in the Bush administration, I was invited by the Clinton administration to serve on the governing board of the National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's called NAEP. That's the national testing program. The results of 2017 were released just a week ago. During my 7-year term on the National Assessment Governing Board, I learned a lot about testing, its strengths and its weaknesses. I tend to rely on NAEP as a barometer because it has no stakes attached to it. No student, no teacher, or no school gets rewards or punishments tied to NAEP scores. After my stint in the government, I became active in 3 different conservative think tanks. I was an advocate for testing and standards in charter schools. I even supported an experiment in school vouchers. Why did I support school choice? Like many reformers today, I wanted to try something completely different, and I hope that competitive pressures would force public schools to improve and to provide new opportunities for children who are not making it in public schools. I worked alongside the nation's leading advocates for school choice when I was at the Hoover Institution in California. I was in the thick of the fight for standards, testing, accountability, and charters. I endorsed No Child Left Behind. But then something very curious happened. This is a very strange turn of events. I lost the faith. For nearly a decade, I participated in the discussions of this very high-powered group at the Hoover Institution. Within the confines of our sheltered world, we admitted to one another that many charter schools were performing poorly. Many of them were closing. Many were doing worse than the so-called failing schools that the children were supposedly fleeing from. We candidly discussed what to do, and the usual answer was close them down and start over with another charter school. We discussed the problems of evaluating teachers by test scores. One of our task force members, a very eminent economist at Stanford, insisted that the best way to improve teaching was to every year fire 5 to 10% of the lowest performing teachers, the ones whose kids did not have scores that went up. So you judge teachers by the test scores of their students. And that raised the question, well, what if this method of evaluating teachers produced shortages? And he assured us that there would never be shortages. There would always be more people standing in line, willing to teach, and better than those who were fired. He worked it out on a napkin. Well, even while working diligently within this group, I read what the critics said. And somewhere along the line, I stopped believing in what I had advocated for many years. One breaking point came when one of my colleagues at Hoover said that he was looking forward to the day when public schools and teachers' unions were eliminated. I didn't agree. I didn't belong to a teachers' union, but I supported the right of working people to bargain collectively. As a graduate of public schools, I didn't want to see public schools disappear and be replaced by privately run schools. Another critical point was when I realized that NCLB was failing and that it was actually harming the quality of education. In November of 2006, I attended a seminar at a conservative think tank in DC where the subject was, how is NCLB doing 5 years after it was enacted? I was asked to comment on a dozen scholarly papers, every paper reporting on states and school districts from Miami and New Jersey to California, big districts, small districts, rural districts. Every paper concluded that NCLB was not working. At the end of the day, what could I say other than that NCLB was not working? By 2007, I was turning into a critic of the very ideas that I had once championed. I no longer believed that standards in testing, competition, and choice would lead to better education. In 2008, still active in the Hoover Group, the group decided that it would make recommendations about how to fix NCLB, which everyone recognized was deeply flawed. And the group said, mend it. And I said, end it. No one else agreed with me. I had turned into a dissident. And I offered to resign, but they said, no, we need someone to argue with. Stay, don't go. So I hung around for another year, arguing all the time, being the sole dissenter. And in 2009, I finally resigned my think tank affiliation, stepped away from a very nicely funded gravy train, and completed a book about my disillusionment with the testing and choice movement, and it came out in 2010. It was called The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education. That book became a national bestseller, and the New York Times interviewed me to ask about my changing my mind. And the story was, she changed her mind. This is a big deal. She changed her mind. The Wall Street Journal asked me to write an article called Why I Changed My Mind. This was apparently such a rare phenomenon that everyone asked me again and again, why did you change your mind? They still ask me, even though I wrote a book about it. The truth, I changed my mind because I found out I was wrong. That's really hard to admit. Then I discovered I was later interviewed by a writer who is a specialist in interviewing people who change their mind. Her name is Catherine Schultz. She's now a writer for The New Yorker, and she calls herself a wrongologist. I had to say I was wrong. I had to admit it. I wanted the world to know that I admitted my errors and that I would work as hard as I could to combat the ideas that I once embraced. In the book, I acknowledge the root causes of low academic performance. The root cause is poverty, not bad schools and not bad teachers. Every standardized test, whether it is state, national, international, college entry, whatever it is, every standardized test reflects this simple fact. Students from advantaged homes have the highest scores and students from the poorest homes have the lowest scores. There will always be deviations. There will be students from very wealthy families who are dumb. That's true, and they don't have high scores. They're outliers. There will be students who come from poverty who are incredibly brilliant and have high scores. But look at any outcome of any standardized test, and at the top are the most advantaged, and at the bottom are the least advantaged. And the stair steps along the way go up or down depending on family income. So we could actually save a lot of money, not give any tests, and just check out on the family income. Well, I devoted a chapter in the book to the influence of billionaire philanthropists and what I call the corporate reform movement. I wrote about the combined efforts of the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, and the Walton Foundation to promote charter schools and high-stakes testing. I called them the Billionaire Boys Club. I later discovered that the Billionaire Boys Club was much, much larger. It includes hedge fund managers, Wall Street tycoons, and of course, the DeVos family and the Koch brothers. Eli Broad, the Los Angeles billionaire, got his start in the public schools of Michigan, but has devoted many millions of dollars to replacing public schools with charter schools. He helped to fund the disastrous Educational Achievement Authority in Detroit, which used the city's children as guinea pigs for experimental technology, undermined the struggling public schools, and ultimately closed as an abject failure, although the people who ran it were very, very well paid. Why are so many billionaires working together to destroy what belongs to the public? I've thought about this a lot, and I know that they're not doing it to make money. They're already billionaires, and they have more money than they can spend in 10 lifetimes. My best answer as to why they're doing it is simply arrogance. They think that because they're very rich, they must be smarter than everyone else, but they're not. They surround themselves with yes men and women. They ignore critics, and they ignore evidence. Failure does not deter them. If they ran their businesses the way they ran their theories about education, they would all be bankrupt. I concluded that the high-stakes testing in No Child Left Behind had failed and that it would never improve education. Standardized tests can never close achievement gaps and can never improve achievement because they are scored on a bell curve. By design, guess what? The bell curve never closes. It can't. It's designed not to close. It wouldn't be a bell curve if it could close. Children with disabilities, children who are English language learners, children who live in poverty will cluster in the bottom of the bell curve. That's the way it always works. Based on my experience on the governing board of NAEP, I knew that standardized tests are subject to all sorts of errors. Some questions that I reviewed have 2 right answers. Some have no right answers. Some of the stories from which the questions were drawn were confusing. And I could imagine that in many cases a very thoughtful child would struggle and say, maybe this is the right answer, and get the wrong answer because they overthought the question. High-stakes testing, meaning the threat of rewards and punishments, has narrowed the curriculum to only what was tested, and consequently many schools have eliminated or reduced the time available for the arts, civics, history, foreign languages, even physical education. Threatening to punish schools, principals, and teachers not only narrowed the curriculum, but encouraged cheating and gaming the system. The inevitable result of this NCLB testing regime was to ruin education, which should be about citizenship, character, intellectual curiosity, love of learning, personal development, not test scores. Sadly, the relentless pursuit of higher test scores crowds out what matters most. Offering merit pay or bonuses has been tried for 100 years. It's never worked. Merit pay is what I call a zombie idea. It never works and it never dies. It has eternal life. In 2010 in Nashville, teachers were offered a bonus of $15,000 if they raised math scores. There was a control group, there was an experimental group, it was a carefully controlled experiment, and after 3 years, the economist who ran the experiment concluded that the bonus didn't make any difference. Why? Because both groups of teachers were already doing the best they knew how. They were not hiding their best lessons in hopes of winning a bonus. So in the book, Death and Life of the Great American School System, I showed that the evidence on charters and vouchers was largely negative. The best you could say was that they made no difference. Some charters were good, some charters were terrible, but on average they were no better than the public schools that they replaced. Some charters close in mid-year, some charters are run by scoundrels who have no education background. And in the meanwhile, the charter sector has been infected by a profusion of for-profit entrepreneurs who know more about making money in real estate than they do about education. The NCLB was followed by the Obama-Duncan program called Race to the Top, which put even more emphasis on high-stakes testing, on charter schools, on closing schools with low test scores, and evaluating teachers by test scores. I refer to Race to the Top as NCLB 2.0. In the wake of the financial collapse of 2008, Congress gave $100 billion to Arne Duncan. $95 billion went to school districts in economic distress so that they wouldn't have to lay off huge numbers of teachers. $5 billion was set aside for whatever he wanted to do to promote his reform agenda, which he called Race to the Top. Now, think of that, $5 billion in discretionary funds. I told you that when I was Assistant Secretary of Education, we had $10 million. That gives you some idea of the proportion of $5 billion to do whatever you want. He used this $5 billion as a big prize for states that adopted his ideas, none of which had any evidence or record of success behind them. States were not eligible to compete for the money unless they agreed to increase the number of charter schools, close down low-performing schools, or turn them around by firing everyone who was on their staff, firing all the teachers, all the lunch ladies, everyone, and the principal, adopt the Common Core standards, and evaluate teachers and principals by the test scores of their students. Again, no evidence for any of this, but it was required. Subsequent evaluations have shown that the $5 billion was wasted. It produced teacher bashing, demoralization, and teacher shortages. The scores from the NAEP, this national assessment that's done every 2 years, from 2013 to 2017 showed that student performance on the national test in reading and in math flatlined, and the achievement gaps among kids at the top and those at the bottom have grown larger. In 2013, I published another book critiquing this punitive approach to education reform. It was called Reign of Error, the Hoax of the Privatization Movement and the Danger to America's Public Schools. Now, the reason I wrote this second book was because I was being interviewed by a magazine writer, and he said, well, in this last book, Death and Life, you give all the reasons that they're wrong, but what are your solutions? Everybody says that I talk to who criticizes you says, what are your solutions? So Reign of Error contains, about a third of the book is devoted to solutions. And those solutions begin with acknowledging the United States has one of the worst records in the world for providing prenatal care to pregnant women. And we're tied in the ranking done by the World Health Organization, the March of Dimes, when measuring the quality of prenatal care or just the availability of prenatal care to pregnant women. We're ranked somewhere like 132nd or so in the world. We're tied with Somalia. I mean, it is insane that we're not willing to invest in the health of pregnant women because their health affects the well-being of the child that they give birth to. We also happen to have the highest maternal death rate of any advanced nation in the world, which is also insane. But in terms of prenatal care, it matters because when women don't have adequate prenatal care, they are at risk of giving birth to children with birth defects, cognitive disabilities, and we could pay for their prenatal care up front or pay for the care of the children born with birth defects for the rest of their lives. Doesn't prevention sound better than dealing with something that we refused to deal with when it was reasonable? But that was my number one. I went on to the gap between prenatal care and early childhood education. And all of this was research-based: early childhood education, reduced class size, paying teachers more, treating teachers as professionals, having a curriculum that was rich in the arts and in all of the things that we know that are important for the schooling of children. And then talking about so the book was saying, in effect, we don't have an educational crisis, we have a social crisis. It's a social crisis made up of poverty, inequality, and racial segregation. These are the root causes of educational failure. But Congress, the Department of Education, and the people who call themselves reformers prefer to keep on testing and keep on opening charter schools. It's so much cheaper to do that than to deal with the real problems. What I realized when I wrote the second book was that the testing and accountability movement are the handmaiden of the privatization movement. Testing labels public schools as failures. After all, there will always be a bottom 5%. And the schools in the bottom 5% are then stigmatized, closed, and their students handed over to charter operators. The hoax was to refer to the school choice movement as reform, when in fact it is a privatization movement. Did President Obama and Secretary Duncan realize that lurking in the background of the charter movement were the Koch brothers and the DeVos family, avid proponents of school choice? American education has had many reform movements. Real reformers wanted to improve the public schools, not to eliminate them. Real reformers wanted higher standards for admission to teaching, higher pay for teachers, reduced class size, especially for the neediest students, higher and more equitable funding of schools, better textbooks, better teaching materials, school integration, better curriculum, better this, better that. That's what reformers want. They don't want to eliminate, they don't want to close public schools and turn them over to private management, because that is an abdication of responsibility. That's saying that the people who are in charge of the public system actually don't know what to do. So they're just going to hand it off to some private group. As we know from watching Secretary DeVos, the so-called reformers actually have no idea about how to help struggling schools. They just want to close them and turn them over to a charter, a religious school, or a private school. What they want is a free market in education. The reformers never stop to worry about the damage they do to public schools, which still enroll about 90% of America's children. It doesn't disturb them when charters exclude children with disabilities or children who are English language learners. It doesn't concern them when charters have high suspension rates and punitive disciplinary policies. They actually like those punitive disciplinary policies. I just read last night about a conference in Puerto Rico recommending no excuses charter schools for the children of Puerto Rico because they need that rigid discipline. I think of that as a form of neocolonialism, quite frankly. Because you may have noticed, there are no excuses schools in affluent neighborhoods. This is for the children of the poor. And this is the curious thing, which I've noticed in the last couple of years as the research keeps getting worse and worse for the charters and vouchers. The reformers no longer care about test scores because the charters and vouchers are not getting the sky-high scores. Choice has become an end in itself. Dick and Betsy DeVos have been pushing for vouchers for many years. In 2000, they launched a state referendum in Michigan to change the state constitution to allow vouchers. Michigan, like many states, has a constitutional amendment that says no public money will go to sectarian religious schools. Voters opposed this referendum by an overwhelming majority of 69 to 31%. If it were a presidential election, we would call that more than a landslide. Other states, like Indiana, Florida, and Nevada, have exactly the same constitutional prohibition against vouchers in their state constitutions, but choice-friendly legislators there and choice-friendly courts have simply ignored the state constitution and created voucher programs that are called something else. They may be called education savings accounts, tuition tax credits, opportunity scholarships, very creative naming for vouchers. A rose is a rose is a rose. A voucher is a voucher, and so is an educational savings account, a tuition tax credit, or an opportunity scholarship. Most of these are tax avoidance schemes that allow corporations and wealthy individuals to pay money into a private scholarship fund instead of paying taxes. That means there's more money for private tuition and less money for public schools. Now, I oppose public funding of religious schools. I believe in the separation of church and state. The state should not pay for religious education. We now have plenty of evidence about voucher schools because we now have a number of states that offer vouchers. They're free to discriminate even though they operate with public funds. They're free to exclude students with disabilities. They're free to discriminate against students who are not part of their religious community. They're free to discriminate against students and staff who are LGBT. They're free to teach racism and creationism. Why should public dollars support or become entangled with religious views? This is why the founders quite wisely Thomas Jefferson spoke of a wall of separation between church and state. They were aware of the religious wars that had racked Europe for hundreds of years, and they didn't want to bring those wars here. There are over 300 different religious groups in the United States today. Why should taxpayers support their schools and allow them to discriminate against other people? Today, almost 20 years after the start of NCLB, we have more evidence about high-stakes testing, about evaluating teachers, about test scores, about charters and vouchers than we did in 2001 when the law was written. We have the example of Detroit, where half the students are in charter schools, yet Detroit remains the lowest scoring city in the nation on the NAEP test, and most of the charters are no better or worse than the public schools. We have the example of Milwaukee, which for more than 25 years has had a full-blown charter sector, voucher sector, and public sector. All three sectors get the same results, just as Secretary DeVos said. All three sectors are doing terribly. Milwaukee overall is one of the lowest performing cities in the nation, just above Detroit. Competition has lifted no boats. They're all at the bottom of the swamp. African American students in Milwaukee have scores that are about the same as African American students in the poorest states in the Deep South. All that choice and no improvement. What is today called reform in education is indeed a hoax. The public is led to believe that reformers have a clear roadmap of how to improve education, but they don't. They have only one idea, school choice. When choice fails, they have no other ideas. They say, if choice fails, try more choice. For many decades, the term school choice was stigmatized because it was closely associated with the white Southern governors and senators who fought against the Brown v. Board decision of 1954. These politicians adopted school choice to prevent desegregation of their public schools. State after state put forward school choice plans, knowing that white students would choose to remain in white schools and black students would be intimidated by threats of violence and would choose to stay in black schools. The term school choice was the rallying cry of segregationists. And for many years, the term school choice was stigmatized because of its well-known history. From 1954 until 1964, the segregationists held the line against desegregation, and school choice was their main strategy. But in 1964, responding to race riots in the major cities and to the sweeping election of President Lyndon B. Johnson, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which made de jure segregation illegal. The law forbade spending any federal money for segregated facilities. Since there was very little federal money for education in 1964, Southerners did not feel immediately threatened. But in 1965, Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which offered substantial federal funding to poor districts, and the Southern districts had to choose between money and segregation because they had the most poor districts and they stood to get the most money. Over the next several years, the federal courts and the U.S. Office of Education worked together, demanding actual integration, not just school choice. There was more progress made towards desegregating American public schools in the decade from 1965 to 1975 than before or since. At the same time that desegregation advanced, the academic progress of African American students accelerated, and the achievement gaps between white and black students narrowed. The greatest narrowing of racial achievement gaps occurred in the late 1970s and early 1980s when desegregation peaked. I often hear people say that we tried desegregation and it didn't work, but it's not true. We tried desegregation and it did work. Longitudinal studies done by researchers at the University of California at Berkeley show that black students who attended desegregated schools were more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to attend college, more likely to complete college, and more likely to have successful lives than black students who went to segregated schools, and furthermore, to pass on those advantages to their children. Unfortunately, we have elected people in high office who did not see the long-term benefits to our society. The courts became more conservative and less willing to enforce desegregation orders. The orders that were in effect were canceled or forgotten or withdrawn. And as the courts retreated, racial segregation made a resurgence. I've often thought that the Obama administration's Race to the Top program could have changed the narrative. Instead of offering $5 billion for higher test scores and Common Core and more charters, it could have offered that princely sum to districts and states that presented the best and most realistic plans to desegregate their schools. Such an approach would have changed the face of the nation. But they didn't do it, and Race to the Top was a mighty flop. All it succeeded in doing was laying the groundwork for Betsy DeVos. Michigan knows Secretary DeVos all too well. She has spent the past 30 years or so crusading to privatize public education. She is on a mission. She's now Secretary of Education. She comes to her job as the first secretary in the history of the department who is actively hostile to public schools. It is indeed ironic that the Obama administration put so much emphasis and so much money into charter schools because it's one of Betsy DeVos's favorite causes. Charter schools feed the narrative that the private sector knows better than the public sector. But we now know that this is not true. Charter schools open and close like daylilies, sometimes in the middle of the year. There is no evidence that creating more charter schools will improve public schools or even provide better education to the students in the charter schools, and the competition has no impact at all. Public schools are a public good. Everyone pays for them whether or not they have children, whether or not their own children are finished with schooling, and whether or not their own children attend them. We pay for them as citizens just as we pay for police, fire departments, highways, sanitations, beaches, parks, and protection of the water and the air. At least I think we still pay for protection of the water and the air. I haven't seen the headlines today. These are public responsibilities. They should not be privatized. If you don't like the police department, don't expect the public to pay for your private security guard. If you don't want to use the community pool, don't expect the public to pay for your private swimming pool. The entire community should pay for good public schools, good public transportation, good public parks, and other public services that belong to the public, that belong to all of us. They should not be privatized. Michigan has been under the influence of DeVos money for many years. Michigan is overrun with charters. 80% of the charters in Michigan have academic performance below the state average, according to Education Trust Midwest, which is pro-charter, by the way, I might add. Michigan, you might say, is the Wild West of charters. 80% of charters, and I'm not sure if it's the same 80% that has below average performance, but 80% of charters in Michigan operate for profit. I'm opposed to for-profit charters on principle because they have to pay investors the money that was intended to go for schools. I'm opposed to for-profit schools and colleges because they're committed above all to profit, not to education. I'm opposed to them because their commitment to profit requires them to cut costs, and the biggest cost in education is teachers and professors. Thus, they're driven by their for-profit status to hire low-wage teachers and professors and to get rid of those with experience who cost more and might one day expect a pension. Charters are the gateway drug to full privatization by vouchers. We now know far more about vouchers than we did in the late 1990s when cities like Milwaukee and Cleveland started using them. The voucher evaluations have not yet identified any city or state where vouchers have been successful in helping poor children. Just in the past 2 years, voucher studies have concurred that students lose ground when they enroll in voucher schools. This was the finding in studies of vouchers in Ohio, Indiana, Louisiana, and the District of Columbia. When Betsy DeVos was confronted with the finding that voucher students in D.C. got lower scores than their peers who stayed in the public schools, her response was interesting. She said that when all three sectors, public, charter, and voucher, are fully implemented, they would all get the same results. I think that means the same results as in Milwaukee. I took this to mean that she no longer claims any academic benefits to attending a charter or religious school. As I said, it's choice simply for the sake of choice. Michigan offers a test case for the benefits or lack thereof of school choice. Secretary DeVos would say that Michigan still needs vouchers, but knowing that vouchers haven't worked anywhere else, that's a doubtful claim. In recent years, Michigan has indeed been an exemplar for school choice. When Betsy DeVos was recently interviewed on 60 Minutes, she was asked about Michigan's academic performance, and she claimed she didn't know. Of course she knew. Michigan has seen significant stagnation and declines across the board for students of every race and income level. She preferred to say, "I don't know," rather than admitting failure. On the NAEP, Michigan saw stagnation as compared to other states. Test scores fell in some subjects from the middle of the pack to the bottom 10. Professor Brian Jacob of the University of Michigan studied the national test, and he said that Michigan ranks dead last in terms of proficiency growth since 2003. This lack of academic progress, and in some cases decline, affected every demographic. The head of the state's House Education Committee saw this bad news as proof that there was no point in just throwing money at schools. Have you noticed any money falling into your schools, flying in through the door or the window? One district superintendent said, however, that, quote, "Because we were focused on penalizing the worst schools with the highest poverty and obstacles to overcome, we forgot there were real children with real needs who actually need to be educated." Our Secretary of Education refuses to learn from what has happened to her own state. She learned nothing from the failure of the Education Achievement Authority. She learned nothing from charter failures in other states, like Tennessee, which started something called the Achievement School District, where they clustered the lowest performing schools in the state into a non-contiguous district. All of them were turned over to charter operators. The promise was made that within 5 years, the lowest 5% would be in the top 20%. And 5 years later, they're all in the bottom 5%, except for one that's in the bottom 6%. Secretary DeVos, will not pay attention to the failure of school choice. She won't believe it, and she won't care. Nor will she care about the segregating effects of school choice. This is her horse. She will not change, no matter what the evidence. So when anyone brings up Michigan, she says she prefers to talk about Florida. It's warmer. But Florida has charters and vouchers and higher test scores than Michigan. She thinks Florida is a national model. But Florida is not a national model. On the latest NAEP and on the one before that, Florida was right about at the national average. Why would you choose a state as a national model that's right at the national average rather than the highest performing state, which is Massachusetts? Massachusetts doesn't have vouchers, and it just has a few charters. And they had an election in Massachusetts in 2016 on a proposition of whether the state should expand the number of charters, since there were a small number. And all the dark money poured into Massachusetts, millions and millions of dollars. They outspent the teachers and parents at least by double. When the election was over, the vote was 62 to 38 against expanding charters. And the vote against charters was greatest in the communities that already had charters, because they knew that the money that went to charter schools would be taken out of their public schools. And there's a very strong tradition in Massachusetts of local control, and they didn't want to have unelected boards taking money away from their local public schools, which they really like. They happen to be the best scoring state in the nation, and why the charter people thought that would be a juicy target, I think speaks to their intelligence. So people have asked me again and again, is there a district that's doing the right thing? Is there a district that has a different answer than testing and choice, carrots and sticks, rewards and punishments? And I didn't have an answer. I mean, I really scrambled to find something, because everybody has this heavy, dark cloud of No Child Left Behind that becomes Race to the Top, that becomes every student succeeds, except no one really believes that every student will succeed because they named a law that. But now I have an answer for them. And you will not be surprised to learn it's Kalamazoo. And I spoke last week in Santa Fe, and I told them about the Kalamazoo Promise. And I spoke the week before that in Seattle, and I told them about the Kalamazoo Promise. And I said, why doesn't Bill Gates personally pay for every student in Washington to go to a college or university in the state of Washington? It would be pocket change for him. I asked them to carry the message, but I'm not sure if he got it. Well, I didn't know about the Kalamazoo Promise until I made plans to visit here. And your Professor Gary Moran sent me a packet of information, and I have to say I was blown away. You know the story. Every graduate of your public schools is eligible for a scholarship to a public or private college in state if they attend for a minimum of 4 years. And for those who've been enrolled in KPS from kindergarten through senior year, the promise covers full tuition fees. It's fabulous. And so I read about this and learned the funds for the promise are available for 10 years after graduation, and the donor or donors are anonymous. And the program, they say, is funded in perpetuity. Now, the only place I've seen anything remotely comparable to this was when I visited Finland. And I was told that in Finland, all higher education is tuition free. And I said, does that include graduate school? They said, yes. Education is a basic human right, and you don't make people pay for a human right. The great Hebraic scholar Maimonides wrote that there are 8 levels of charity. The lowest level is to give a donation grudgingly. The 7th level is to give less than one can afford, but cheerfully. The 6th level is to give directly to the needy when asked. The 5th level is to give directly without being asked. The 4th level is to give an anonymous person but get credit for the gift. The 3rd level is when the donor knows the recipient, but the recipient doesn't know where the money came from. The 2nd level is when the donor and the recipient are unknown to one another, much like assistance provided by a communal fund. The highest level of charity is to help sustain a person by offering a substantial gift in a dignified manner and by helping him or her become independent. Now, given this typology, I say the Kalamazoo Promise is the highest form of good deed. It gives young people the guarantee that they will be able to afford higher education and make a better life for themselves and their families without assuming the burden of a great debt. It gives students the means to become independent. It's up to them to work for it. It's up to them to succeed in college, but they can go to college debt-free. This is the highest form of philanthropy. How different this is from the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, the Walton Foundation, and so many other foundations which now invest in school privatization to destroy public schools and in Teach for America to undermine the teaching profession. Instead of threats and rewards, the promise has promoted collaboration and encouraged optimism and hope for the future. The outcomes are clear. Parents, teachers, and students raise their aspirations. Schools become focused on preparing students for success in higher education. Suddenly, higher education becomes a realistic goal for everyone who graduates. Parents, teachers, and school staff recognize the value of tutoring and mentoring programs. The promise gave a large boost to universal pre-K in Kalamazoo, and more students enrolled in full-day kindergarten. Before the announcement of the promise, enrollment in the Kalamazoo public schools was declining. Since 2005, the trend line reversed, and enrollment has grown by 25%. In a review of the outcomes a few years ago, Professor Moran and his colleagues reported that about 85% of eligible high school graduates are taking advantage of the program, while others enrolled in out-of-state public universities. And about 2/3 of those who have received the scholarship enrolled in 4-year public universities in Michigan, while the other 1/3 took classes at community college. Perhaps the most important conclusion of the study was that, as he wrote, diverse stakeholders are more united in a common goal, and a college-going culture is being established in a struggling urban district. In contrast to competition and choice, which pits students against students, teachers against teachers, schools against schools, and districts against districts, Kalamazoo has chosen to build its goals around collaboration and teamwork. The national model has failed and failed again. The Kalamazoo model is a success because it builds on the right values and the right ideals. What you have demonstrated in Kalamazoo is that hope inspires better outcomes than fear, that encouragement is more powerful than threats, and that a community that works together for the betterment of all its children is the ideal we must foster. A great change is on the horizon for public education. This is what my next book is about, is the change that's coming, and it is coming. You can't have 20 years of failure and continue to invest in failure. After 20 years of failed federal policies, many people are looking for examples of success. They're few. Every state, every school district has suffered under the yoke of high-stakes testing and privatization. We now know much more than we did when NCLB began its reign of error. We know that we're the only nation in the world that tests every student every year from grades 3 through 8. We know that none of the reformers' ideas has succeeded. We were promised that Common Core would lift test scores and close achievement gaps. We were told that school choice would lift achievement to new heights. None of these promises have panned out. Kalamazoo is one of the few notable success stories. I hope it is widely emulated. I thank you for bringing to Kalamazoo. I leave you inspired, encouraged, and hopeful for the future. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Please, can you take questions? If there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer for a few minutes. Questions, anyone? Yes, sir, in front.
I'm sort of curious if you can comment on the use of lotteries to fund public education.
The use of lotteries?
Lotteries, yeah. State lotteries,
Mm-hmm.
like that.
You know, I don't think it hurts, but I think the responsibility of the state government and the federal government, but especially the state government, is to fund public education. Not to have a lottery for public education, but to fund public education.
Well, in particular, I'm thinking that it...
Right. Well, lotteries are a regressive form of taxation, but so is the sales tax. The most progressive form of taxation is income tax, in which those who have the most pay the most. But, you know, a state like Washington State, for example, has no income tax and no corporate tax, and their schools are underfunded. And we have been, as you can see, when you read about the stories from whether it's Oklahoma or any of these other states where teachers are walking out, the legislatures and governors there have wanted to cut taxes for the wealthy, and they still believe in trickle-down economics. In Kansas, they tried that for years. They starved public services, and they finally had a revolt against this trickle-down economics. It simply doesn't work. You cannot provide decent public services, and you will not attract industries and jobs to a state that doesn't have good schools. So the school should be directly funded by the government as direct school aid. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I've always seen this charter school thing as segregation. And undoing Brown versus Board of Education, it's outcomes. You're going to have haves and have-nots. So going to welcome to charter school, or you're going to have the limited resources being split between both the have-nots and the have-nots.
Well, I think that the move towards charter schools is a recreation of a dual school system. I mean, one of the things that the Brown decision tried to remedy was having a dual school system, one for whites, one for blacks. And in the South, the charter schools have become a means of resegregating. And in North Carolina, for instance, which was one of the most integrated states, the charter schools have become their white flight academies, and then their charters that are all black. And one of the people who call themselves reformers are trying to say, by having all black charter schools with high scores, look, we don't need integration. We have high scoring, completely segregated schools. But the reason they do that is because they practice a very sophisticated means of excluding kids with disabilities, excluding kids who are English language learners, kicking out kids with low scores, and having, they start with this many kids and then they do attrition. And at the end, there are very few left, and they say, well, look, they got high scores. The highest performing charter school in New York State, which has, you know, knocked the socks off everybody in terms of test scores, does not accept any new children after third grade. So that's a way of saying we've got the kids we want, we're going to work on them, and nobody else gets in. They started with 100 kids in kindergarten, and they just graduated their first class of 17. So this is not a model for public education. Public education, I mean, it was a great struggle to eliminate de jure segregation. It was a great struggle to make sure that children who were English language learners were provided appropriate services, and that was the Supreme Court decision. And it was a great struggle to ensure that children with disabilities were entitled to a free public education. But the charters don't have to follow any of that. So I think it's a regressive step, and we're going to have to struggle with this for a long time. Yes?
Dr. Ravitch, first of all, I hope you know that you are a source of hope. We look at them all the time. Yourself doing it will be really. What if you comment a little bit about teacher evaluation?
Oh, okay.
Where teachers mark down if they don't have their goal on the board all the time, even for kindergarten. No credit for
Yeah, I was going to say that I realized as I was talking that I didn't go into teacher evaluation enough. The teacher evaluation piece especially comes from two sources. The Gates Foundation and Race to the Top both agreed that teachers were the problem. And it began when, in Central Falls, Rhode Island, when the superintendent of the poorest, smallest district in Rhode Island decided that the way to raise test scores was to fire everybody. And she did, and she was backed up by the state superintendent and hailed by Arnie Duncan as being a hero and put in the Time magazine for her courage. All of this had to do with firing people without anyone actually being evaluated personally. So it was just like a mass punishment for the whole school. And then the Gates Foundation got onto this kick, and they handed out huge grants to Pittsburgh, to Hillsborough County, to a group of charter schools, all about proving that if you use test scores, you can identify the best teachers and the worst teachers, and you fire the worst teachers. Well, it turns out that in Florida, where they embraced the evaluation of teachers by test scores, they had a lot of problems. First of all, most teachers don't have annual test scores, so they can't be evaluated by test scores. High school teachers don't have annual test scores, only teachers in grades 3 through 8 who teach reading and math. So that leaves out the art teachers, the physical education teachers, the specialty teachers, just those who, it's like 30% of the teachers. So in Florida, they said, well, we will assign teachers the test scores of some other teacher. Pardon? Oh, well, they said that actually teachers, the Florida Education Association went to court and sued and said it wasn't fair because teachers were being evaluated based on students they never taught and subjects they had never taught. And the judge said it may be unfair, but it's not unconstitutional. However, it has been thrown out in a number of places. In New York, there was a case brought by, there was a fourth grade teacher who everybody knew was the best teacher in the school, and she got a low rating. For what reason, I don't know, but she had the good fortune to be married to a lawyer. So he brought her case to court, and the judge said her score was arbitrary and capricious, but it wasn't a class action. But that's the groundwork. Then in Houston, Texas, they had one of the worst teacher evaluation systems in the country, and the judge in Houston said, no one understands the formula for evaluating teachers. I certainly don't. I'm throwing the whole thing out. So Houston got rid of teacher evaluation. Hillsborough County, which was one of Gates's one where he pledged $100 million, after he had given $80 million, Hillsborough said, we have exhausted our $250 million in reserve trying to make this work. It doesn't work. Please, go away and don't come back anymore. Gone. It's gone, left to Hillsborough County. Pittsburgh, the other showcase district, just last week announced that they were no longer going to do evaluating teachers by test scores and giving bonuses and merit pay and all that stuff. So slowly this big ship is turning because evaluating teachers by test scores is flawed. And what I quoted on my blog and in my book was a statement in 2014 by the American Statistical Association saying, don't do this. You cannot evaluate teachers this way. First of all, because children are not randomly assigned to classes. You may have a great class this year and a not so good class the next year. If you have lots of kids with disabilities, you're not going to get big test score gains. If you have lots of kids who have, whatever kinds of obstacles they're facing. But if you're teaching in a really nice suburban school where all the kids come from rich families, you're going to get great test scores. So is that teacher in the affluent district a better teacher? No, it doesn't make any sense. And there were so many problems with this that it's going to go away. But the best way to make it go away is to vote and throw these people out who do this. Next question. Yes, sir, on the end.
I'd like to elaborate what you just said. On today's blog, you wrote, in my view, Democrats won't start winning seats again until they embrace public schools again. Break free of their love affair with charters and other free market solutions, created their message and turned them into Republican light. What can we do to make public education a central issue in national politics?
I think that the question was, he was quoting something I posted on my blog today that said that the Democrats are not going to be successful until they recognize that they are connected viscerally to public education and not to charter schools and not to any of these kind of free market neoliberal schemes that they got sucked into by the Gates Foundation and by false friends. And that they should let what I wrote in Death and Life was there came a point where the Democratic and Republican approaches to education converged. And that was very bad for the Democrats. And they started losing election because their base, the base of the Democratic Party, a very important base, is teachers. And there are 3 to 4 million teachers in America. And when people are turned off and think, well, you're no different from the other guys, they don't bother to vote. And the way to get teachers excited is to believe in the importance of teaching, to respect the profession, to not just pay lip service, but recognize that the teachers hold the key to our future and that a society that doesn't invest in teachers is also not investing in children and is not investing in its future. And the Democratic Party has to return to its historic roots, which was, it was the party of public education. It was not the party of privatization. And so much of what has happened these past dozen years or so came about because of third way politics. You know, like I'm not going to be over here on, let's see, this is the right, this is the left. I'm not going to be, you know, on this side of the equation. I'm going to straddle and have one foot in every camp. And you can't do that because you can't be a pretend Republican. You have to be a real Democrat. The best thing that happened this past year was the election of Ralph Northam in Virginia. Northam campaigned as adamantly pro-public education. He had, his biggest supporters were the Virginia Education Association. They worked very hard for him. He knew it. He won the primary against a candidate who had been supported by Democrats for Education Reform, which is one of these hedge fund manager groups. And he won in large part because of the distinction made between his pro-public education position and the other ones having long associations with, as we call it, DFER, Democrats for Education Reform. You have to kind of be wary of anything called for education reform because it usually means we want to get rid of your public school and take your job away. But Northam appointed a working teacher as the Secretary of Education for the state of Virginia, a middle school social studies teacher. He really means it. And during public school week, the first week in May, I think it is, or early May, Governor Northam will be teaching a class. His wife will be teaching a class. The Secretary of Education is going to travel around the Commonwealth of Virginia and teach every day that week. He's making this public education a priority. There will be no new charter schools open in Virginia while he's governor. I think that sends an important message. Imagine if Michigan were to actually elect somebody committed to public schools. Ultimately, the best defense against what's happening now is electing people who understand. I mean, you have in Michigan, Ellen Kogan-Lipton is running for Congress. She's a great supporter of public education. She fought and exposed the evil doing of the Educational Achievement Authority. But we have to have officials like that who really understand the picture, understand the importance of returning the Democratic Party to its roots and to not being on both sides of issues. Yes, in the back there, a purple shirt.
Yeah, I'm very glad that you spoke about poverty and the relationship between and I'd like to hear more about how we can
Well, if you read what I write, every time I write about schools, I write about schools in a social context. And the social context is today we have probably the greatest income inequality of any advanced nation in the world. Certainly more than at any time in our history, unless you go back to before the 20th century. And I was told at dinner tonight by a member of your faculty that there's even more inequality in China, but we're way off the charts. I mean, if you look at, there's a book I would recommend it to you called The Spirit Level. It was written by a British sociologist. And what they said was that the societies with the greatest equality are the happiest societies. Societies with the greatest inequality are the unhappiest society. That's where you see more alcoholism, suicide, murder, all kinds of drug use, whatever kind of social pathology you want to think of. It's aggravated as there is greater and greater inequality. I think that the most important thing about poverty is that people need to get to work. They have to have the opportunity to get ahead. They have to be able to change their lives. Education is one way, but it's not the only way. Sometimes people just, what they need most is opportunity. We have a government now that's committed not to do anything about poverty because it's committed to giving tax cuts to those who have the most money. And what that says to all of us is that we have to work very hard to change our government, to have people in office who are committed to reducing and eliminating these vast disparities in American society and the struggles that people have, not knowing whether they will be able to eat and not knowing if they'll have a home. It's unimaginable that in one of the richest societies in the world, we still have people who are homeless and hungry, but it's true. Yes. Well, it's been interesting in New York where the opt-out movement was very strong, that there have been tremendous efforts to kill it. And the efforts were, first of all, well, we'll shorten the test, we'll change the test, we'll do this to the test, that to the test. So all kinds of promises were made, but the tests are just as bad as they ever were. Parents are still very upset. The epicenter of the opt-out movement in Long Island, in New York, had the same opt-out rate, which was 50% of the kids didn't take the test. And that sends a very big signal to the people in the state capitol. I don't know what the statewide figures yet will be. It's been running about 20% statewide. It may be 17 or 18%, which they would probably say was a great victory against the, I mean, there has been like full-scale war against the opt-out parents, saying that if your child doesn't take the test, they'll have a low score, your school will be punished, none of this is true. There are no punishment, none at all, but the threats have been there in an effort to quash the movement. But the movement still seems to be going strong, and I think it is the most powerful tool that parents have. In fact, it is virtually the only tool that parents have to stop the testing. If parents tell their children not to take the test, if no one takes the test, then there are no results, and then the whole thing collapses. And by taking the test and giving the test, you're participating in what is really a crime against children, because the standardized tests are really not good tests. And if used, they should be used for diagnostic purposes only, not to label children, not to stigmatize children, not to say to third graders, you're a failure. Yes?
During your time as a conservative think tank, where you were having and also talking with colleagues who said, well, I want to see the destruction of public union schools, can you give us maybe, since you work with these people, can you give us some insight into why do they think this is going to work? What is their desired outcome, and why do they think that's going to work? I can't wrap my head around this.
Well, first of all, they don't like unions because it gives power to teachers, and they don't want teachers to have power. So that's like at the most simple level, and the guy who said that is Terry Moe, and he wrote a book about how terrible unions are. You can go on YouTube and see him ranting about how the unions are ruining education. You know, they protect incompetent teachers, and there shouldn't be tenure, and there shouldn't be pensions, and I don't know. Looking back, I don't know why anyone thinks that people would want to be teachers when the pay is low and there's no pension and there's no tenure and there's no job protection, and you could be fired arbitrarily and capriciously by a vindictive principal. So I think that what allows them to say things like this is that basically they have very little to do with public schools or with teaching. And so they live in a world of ideas where they can think, like one of these guys did a projection that if the U.S. Were to raise test scores by X percent, that the gross national product would increase by trillions of dollars. And there's no evidence for that. It's just, on the back of the napkin kind of speculation. And it's also simply not true. I mean, when you raise test scores, and you can raise them by parrot-type behavior and by training, like training seals. And I think that happened for the first few years of No Child Left Behind. But then the whole test prep thing hit a wall. You can only train kids to get the right answer for so long, and at some point it sort of matters that they don't understand what they've gotten the right answer to. They don't understand, but they know it's the right answer. So why do they think this way? I can't fully account for it, except that they live, for the most part, very privileged and detached lives where they have very little contact with reality.
But do they actually think that this idea of all these rich people having had and the rest of us had not, why do they think that's going to work? It never has before.
Well, it's good for them. Works for them. It depends, where you stand depends on where you sit. Where you stand depends on where you sit. And if it benefits you, then you think it's good. At least most people do. You didn't hear very many corporations complaining about the corporate tax cuts. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us more about your next book project?
What I'm going to write about in the next book is the resistance to all of this and how it has helped to bring it to a halt. And I'm going to write about, for example, the bats. Are there any bats here? Yeah. Here you go. I think the bats have been tremendous. They're very bold and fearless teachers. I'm going to write about a number of incidents. I mean, I could tell stories about the Providence Student Union where the students were told that they would have to take a standardized test to graduate high school. And it's in Providence, Rhode Island, so they were going to be part of a New England compact. And the standardized test was called the New England Comprehensive Assessment Program. The acronym is NECAP. And the students figured out what the grown-ups didn't, which is that a standardized test being normed on a bell curve meant that the kids with disabilities and the kids who were English language learners and the kids who, for whatever reason, were not good at taking tests, they would never graduate. So they began a series of protests where they did what only kids could think of doing. They first staged a zombie march in front of the state education department where they wore white shirts covered with ketchup, and that got attention. And then they ran through the state legislature like mice. What else did they do? They invited 60 accomplished professionals on a Saturday to take release questions from this examination, and 60% of them failed the test. And so, even the Boston Globe carried the newspaper, 60% of the accomplished professionals couldn't pass the test that's required for high school graduation. So they did a number of these kind of wonderfully dramatic incidents which brought attention to the cause, and the state eventually suspended, they put a moratorium on the test. I don't know if they've finally eliminated it. But, at the same time, there are states, I just heard yesterday that Indiana is going to use the SAT for a graduation test, which has got to be one of the stupidest ideas. Now, I can't say the stupidest. There are a lot of other stupid ones. Grading public schools with a letter grade is one of the stupidest ideas. Do you do that in Michigan? Oh. Okay, so here's my take on that. If you have a child and your child comes home from school and the report card has only one letter on it, you as a parent would be outraged. You'd say, my child is not a D, my child is not a B. And it's nice if it's an A, but you'd say, isn't there anything more to that than just a letter grade? And here is a letter grade. This was an idea invented by Jeb Bush to create a ready supply of failing schools that could be then be turned into charters. But the idea was that you would have these letter grades, but it represents an institution with not one child, but 500 or 1,000 children, dozens, if not hundreds of adults, and all these moving parts, and you're going to give this whole institution a letter grade. Well, the only time I can think that this works is the restaurant grading in New York City, where you either have an A or don't go into this restaurant. But the letter grades for schools is a really horrendous idea. I have the same feelings about the parent trigger, which is an idea that really went nowhere at all. So there's been one thing after another, and my editor said I can't just give a list of failures because that's not enough. So I have lots and lots of examples, and I wake up in the middle of the night thinking, oh yes, I forgot that one. So we've had this amazing fusion of bloggers, education bloggers, taking apart all the misdeeds at the top. And they're in Michigan, they're in every state, and they're a network. And they read one another, and they encourage one another, and they have brought to the public through Twitter and through Facebook and through every other form of social media the failures of what's laughingly called reform. So there are a lot of wonderful stories with people behind them, and I want to tell all those stories. I have to also add the Pastors for Texas Children. They are amazing. At the last annual meeting of the Network for Public Education, we invited the head of the Pastors for Texas Children to come. This is a group that has organized some 2,000 Baptist ministers, although I don't think they're only Baptist, but they're all Protestant ministers who believe in the separation of church and state. They have 3 times in a row stopped vouchers in Texas. The leading public official in Texas is the lieutenant governor named Dan Patrick. He is the Rush Limbaugh of Texas. And he's now the most powerful state official, more powerful than the governor. And he's a voucher fanatic. He has been stopped 3 times in a row because the pastors go to the rural communities and they say, you don't want to destroy your local public school, do you? And they say, oh no. So they have created a coalition of rural Republicans and urban Democrats, and vouchers have been stopped 3 times. And they're now expanding to other states. They're working with pastors in Oklahoma and possibly, I think, in Indiana as well. He was our keynote speaker last year, and you know who we had in a group. We're meeting next year, by the way, in Indianapolis, so you're all invited to attend. Our keynote speaker is Pasi Sahlberg from Finland. We're also having the president of the NAACP, and it'll be a great conference, as it always is. But these inspiring stories are happening all over. I mean, like when the mothers of Florida came out and stopped the parent trigger from passing, and Jeb Bush was behind it, and Michelle Rhee was behind it. So volunteers, the people on our side don't have big money. The people on the other side only have money. So we have the feet and they have the money. We have the boots on the ground, they have the money. I wish it were both, but I'd rather be on our side. So that's what I'm going to write about, is this tremendous struggle. And I consider that the reform movement today, corporate reform, although one of the guys writing about Massachusetts said I should refer to it as the financial predators movement. But I think there's a wonderful story to be told about not only the resistance, but also the fact that this movement is not actually a movement. It's simply a very small number of very wealthy people who've decided that they have an idea about how to fix American schools, and their ideas don't work. And they have failed and failed and failed, and they are what I consider dead men walking. They are the ultimate zombie movement. They're propped up only by 2 things. One is the toxic fumes of NCLB, which keeps the testing alive, based on the Texas miracle that never happened. And the other is money. If they didn't have those billionaires, they would all go home. So I can't take the billionaires away, but I can try to make the billionaires feel like they've made a really bad investment, and that they're really unpopular and the American people don't like them and they should stop it. So that's it. Thank you.